Today, in clinics around the world, a quiet revolution is taking place, one embryo at a time. Of all the embryos created through in vitro fertilization, less than 5% undergo comprehensive genetic screening for disease. It's a niche procedure, reserved for those with specific hereditary risks or those who can afford the considerable expense. But what if that number wasn't 5% of IVF births, but 95% of all births, IVF or not, by the year 2045? What if the technology became so routine, so integrated into prenatal care, that it was simply the default path? This isn't a story about a dystopian government mandate forcing genetic purity upon its citizens. It's a much more subtle and perhaps more plausible story about how a series of seemingly rational individual choices, amplified by market forces and social pressures, can fundamentally reshape what it means to be human. It's about how a powerful technology, born from a desire to eliminate suffering, could create a world where the very act of natural, unguided conception becomes a form of descent. The central question we will explore is this: what happens when the choice to have a natural child becomes an act of social rebellion? By the end of our journey, you will understand the invisible architecture of this future. You will see the subtle economic incentives, the shifting social norms, and the slow creep of technological dependency that could guide humanity toward designing itself, not by force, but by consent. We will examine a future where the choice is still technically yours, but the cost of choosing differently, financially, socially, and emotionally, becomes almost impossibly high. This is the story of the choice that isn't really a choice at all. To begin, we must recognize a fundamental pattern in human history. Major technological shifts rarely arrive as a sudden cataclysm. They seep into our lives through the cracks of convenience, safety, and aspiration. Consider the automobile. In the early 20th century, it was a luxury, a novelty. Roads were built for horses. Cities were designed for walking. Choosing to own a car was an exception. Fast forward a few decades, and the entire landscape of society had been re-engineered around it. Suburbs, highways, drive-throughs. The very fabric of daily life presupposed access to a personal vehicle. You could still choose not to own a car, but doing so placed you at a significant disadvantage, isolating you from jobs, from communities, from the standard rhythm of modern life. The choice remained, but the context in which it was made had been completely transformed. We are standing at a similar inflection point with reproductive technology. The tools we will discuss, Preimplantation Genetic Testing, or PGT, and gene editing technologies like CRISPR, are currently in their luxury novelty phase. PGT allows clinicians to screen embryos for major chromosomal abnormalities like the one causing Down syndrome, or for single gene disorders like cystic fibrosis or Huntington's disease. It's seen as a medical intervention, a tool for preventing profound and specific suffering. But the language is already beginning to shift. What begins as a conversation about preventing debilitating disease soon evolves into a discussion about reducing risk. Why not screen for genes that confer a higher predisposition to early onset Alzheimer's or certain types of cancer or heart disease? Each step is logical. Each decision, when viewed in isolation, appears to be an unassailable good. Who wouldn't want to spare their child from a life sentence of genetic illness? The instinct to protect one's offspring is arguably the most powerful force in the natural world. This is the engine that will drive the transition. It won't be a government agency knocking on your door. It will be an insurance provider offering a dramatically lower lifetime premium for a child screened for a panel of 50 preventable conditions. It will be a fertility clinic offering a viability score for each embryo, generated by an AI that has analyzed millions of genomic data points, gently nudging you toward the one with the highest probability of a long and healthy life. It will be the quiet social pressure from friends and family who all went through the standard optimization panel and who might ask with genuine concern why you would choose to take an unnecessary risk. Think about it this way. The decision to vaccinate a child today is, for the vast majority of people in most developed nations, not an agonizing ethical dilemma. It is a routine part of pediatric care, mandated by schools and backed by a global consensus on public health. The infrastructure of society, from our legal system to our educational institutions, is built upon the assumption of vaccination. To opt out is to swim against a powerful current of social and bureaucratic expectation. Now, imagine a future where a genetic inoculation against 100 of the most common and costly hereditary diseases is available. Imagine it is safe, effective, and perhaps even covered by state health care or basic insurance. How long would it take for this procedure to transition from a remarkable medical breakthrough to a standard, expected duty of a responsible parent? This is the invisible architecture we will explore. It is not built from steel and concrete, but from data points, insurance algorithms, and collective anxieties. Its pillars are not laws, but social norms. Its blueprint is not a political manifesto, but the aggregation of millions of private hopes and fears. The future we are contemplating is one where humanity begins to consciously curate its own gene pool, not through the top-down, brutalist ideologies of 20th century eugenics, but through a bottom-up, market-driven, and seemingly compassionate system of choice architecture. The initial resistance to this idea is natural. It feels like science fiction, a step too far. But consider the pace of change. 20 years ago, the idea of carrying a supercomputer in your pocket, connected to the entirety of human knowledge, was a fantasy. Today, it is a global reality that has reshaped industries, politics, and the very nature of human interaction. The technological components for this reproductive future largely exist already, albeit in nascent forms. The AI needed to analyze vast genomic datasets is improving exponentially. The cost of genetic sequencing has plummeted, falling faster than Moore's law, which famously predicted the rate of progress in computing power. What is missing is not the technology itself, but its integration into a seamless, affordable, and socially accepted system. This process of normalization is key. It begins with language. The term designer baby evokes a sense of frivolous enhancement, choosing eye color or athletic prowess. The industry will, and already does, frame it very differently. The conversation is about health, wellness, and giving your child the best possible start in life. It is about preventative medicine on the most fundamental level. The first wave will be exclusively about disease. Clinics will offer panels to screen out tragic conditions, and it will be seen as a profound moral good. The second wave will be about risk reduction, eliminating predispositions to complex illnesses like diabetes or schizophrenia. The third and most transformative wave will be about optimization. The line between preventing a cognitive deficit and enhancing cognitive ability is perilously thin. The boundary between ensuring normal cardiac function and optimizing for superior cardiovascular endurance is a matter of degrees. As we move forward, we will dissect each component of this emerging reality. We will look at the uncomfortable historical echoes of past attempts to improve the human race and ask what, if anything, is different this time. We will dive into the specific technologies on the table today, from the established science of IVF to the cutting edge of CRISPR gene editing, and map their likely trajectory over the next 2 decades. We will follow the money, examining how the cold logic of the insurance and healthcare markets could become the single most powerful force driving this transformation, creating a financial reality where the natural choice is the luxury of the very wealthy or the burden of the very poor. We will step into the shoes of the people living in this future, the parents facing these choices, the children born from them, and the first generation of naturals who may come to see themselves as a disadvantaged minority. The world we are about to explore is not one of good versus evil. It is a world of good versus good, where the desire to protect our children clashes with the value we place on human diversity, and where the freedom to choose is subtly constrained by a system designed to produce the best outcome. It is a quiet, comfortable, and rational path to a future that could leave us stronger, healthier, and perhaps profoundly less human. The choice, for now, is still theoretical, but the architecture is already under construction. To understand the future we are heading towards, we must first look back at the uncomfortable echoes of the past. The word eugenics itself carries a heavy, chilling weight, conjuring images of state-sponsored atrocities and the darkest chapters of the 20th century. But the idea did not begin with jackboots and barbed wire. It began in the quiet, respectable study of a Victorian intellectual named Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin. Galton was a statistician, fascinated by heredity. He observed that desirable traits like intelligence and talent seemed to run in families, and he proposed that humanity could take a hand in its own evolution, encouraging the well-born to reproduce more and the unfit to reproduce less. He called this new science eugenics, from the Greek for good origin. On the surface, in that specific historical context, it was framed as a progressive, scientific endeavor to alleviate human suffering and improve society. The problem was twofold. First, the science was profoundly flawed, conflating complex human traits with simple heredity and confusing correlation with causation. It completely ignored the overwhelming impact of environment, nutrition, education, and economic opportunity, instead attributing poverty and social problems to bad genes. Second, and more catastrophically, the idea was seized upon by the state as a tool of social control. What began as an academic theory mutated into brutal public policy. The United States became a global leader in the eugenics movement. By the 1930s, more than 30 states had laws permitting the forced sterilization of individuals deemed genetically unfit, a category that included the mentally ill, the intellectually disabled, criminals, and often simply the poor and non-white. The infamous 1927 Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell, upheld these laws, with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. declaring, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." This legal framework in America directly inspired the even more horrific racial hygiene laws of Nazi Germany, culminating in genocide. This is the eugenics we remember: top-down, coercive, explicitly racist, and enforced by the full violent power of the state. It was a blunt instrument used to sculpt a population according to a crude and hateful blueprint. The ghost of this history is precisely why any discussion of genetic selection today is met with such immediate and visceral resistance. Yet, the ghost of eugenics does not return wearing the same clothes. The 21st century version, the one we are currently building, operates on an entirely different logic. It is not state-enforced. It is market-driven. It is not framed in the language of racial purity, but in the compassionate language of public health, personal choice, and responsible parenting. It is not coercive. It is seductive. Consider the difference in mechanism. The old eugenics worked by preventing people from being born. The new model works by selecting which people get to be born from a set of potential options. In an IVF clinic, when a doctor and prospective parents look at the genetic reports of 5 available embryos and choose the one free of a gene for a devastating neurological disorder, they are not acting under state command. They are making a private medical choice, guided by a deep and understandable desire to prevent suffering. There is no sinister official stamping a file unfit. There is only a couple, a counselor, and a spreadsheet of data, all aimed at a single benevolent goal: a healthy child. This is what makes the new form so much more complex and, in some ways, more powerful. It sidesteps the ethical tripwires of the past. It's decentralized. There is no central committee deciding what the master race should look like. Instead, there are millions of individual parents making what they believe are the best possible choices for their own families. The desirable human template is not defined in a political manifesto. It emerges as a statistical aggregate of these private decisions, shaped by the tests that clinics choose to offer and the traits that insurance companies choose to incentivize. The pressure to conform is not the threat of the surgeon's knife, but the gentle, persistent nudge of economic and social expectation. The core pattern, however, remains dangerously familiar. At the heart of both the old and the new eugenics is the fundamental idea of defining a desirable human and creating pressure to produce it. In the 20th century, desirable was defined by simplistic and prejudiced notions of race and class. In the 21st century, desirable is being defined by a much more sophisticated and data-driven concept of health and risk. The template is no longer an Aryan ideal, but a genomically optimized one, free from known disease markers, with low predispositions to complex illnesses, and eventually, perhaps, with markers that correlate with positive outcomes like high intelligence or longevity. The pressure to conform to this new template is subtle but pervasive. It's the insurance premium that is $500 cheaper per month if your child's genome has been de-risked. It's the public health campaign, sponsored by a national healthcare service, that highlights the societal cost of preventable genetic diseases. It's the feature article in a parenting magazine about the top 10 genetic markers to screen for. It's the quiet judgment in a playgroup when a child develops a condition that could have been screened out before implantation. Each of these is a small, gentle push, but together they create a powerful current, pulling society toward a specific outcome. The choice to opt out, to embrace the genetic lottery of nature, remains technically possible, but it becomes an increasingly irresponsible one in the eyes of this emerging consensus. This is the crucial distinction and the source of our modern dilemma. We have rejected the brutal, state-sponsored eugenics of the past only to find ourselves building a voluntary, consumer-driven eugenics for the future. It is a system that replaces overt coercion with implicit incentives, and it is arguably more stable and scalable because it aligns with our deepest instincts for the well-being of our children. It presents itself not as an ideology to be imposed, but as a service to be purchased. It speaks not of the purity of the folk, but of the right to a healthy life. But beneath the sanitized language of the clinic and the actuarial table, the fundamental project is the same: the systematic, intentional shaping of the human gene pool based on a preferred set of values. The question is no longer whether we have the power to do this. We do. The question is, who gets to decide what good means and what we might lose when we succeed? To grasp how this future takes shape, we need to move beyond theory and look at the actual tools on the workbench today. These aren't speculative technologies from a distant future. They are real, functioning systems being used in clinics right now. Their capabilities are simply becoming more precise, more affordable, and more widespread with each passing year. The foundation of this entire enterprise is in vitro fertilization, or IVF. For decades, IVF has been a solution for infertility, a medical procedure to help people build families who otherwise couldn't. But its most important role in our story is that it creates a crucial access point, a moment when human embryos exist outside the body, in a petri dish, available for analysis before a pregnancy begins. Without this step, none of the subsequent choices are possible. Once that access point is established, the first major tool comes into play: Preimplantation Genetic Testing, or PGT. This is the technology that allows us to read the genetic story of an embryo. There are a few variations. PGTA screens for aneuploidy, which is an abnormal number of chromosomes, the most well-known example being the extra copy of chromosome 21 that results in Down syndrome. PGTM screens for monogenic, or single-gene disorders. If a family has a history of a specific, devastating illness, like cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, or Tay-Sachs, PGTM can identify which embryos carry the faulty gene, allowing parents to select an embryo that will not inherit the condition. This is the front line of the technology today, a powerful tool used almost exclusively to prevent severe, clearly defined, and often tragic diseases. It is seen as a clear and unambiguous medical good. But even at this stage, a layer of new technology is being added that hints at the future. This is the role of artificial intelligence. Selecting the best embryo is not just about avoiding a specific disease. Clinics also want to choose the embryo most likely to result in a successful pregnancy. Historically, this was a subjective art, with an embryologist looking through a microscope to assess the physical structure and development of the embryos. Today, AI systems are being trained on vast data sets, hundreds of thousands of images and videos of embryos correlated with their genetic data and eventual birth outcomes. These machine learning models can detect microscopic patterns and markers of viability that are invisible to the human eye. Companies like Alife and Embryonics are already deploying these AI platforms to provide a viability score for each embryo, helping clinics improve their success rates. Notice the subtle but profound shift here. The decision-making process is already becoming a partnership between human intuition and algorithmic analysis. The AI is not yet selecting for traits like intelligence or height, but it is establishing a critical precedent, using complex computational analysis to rank and grade potential human lives based on desired outcomes. The infrastructure for optimization is being built under the benevolent banner of simply improving IVF success. The same analytical engine used to predict viability can, with different training data, be used to predict other probabilities. The probability of reaching a certain height, the probability of having an IQ above a certain threshold, the probability of living past 100. The tool is neutral. The only thing that changes is the question we ask it. Now, let's add the second more powerful tool to the workbench, CRISPR-Cas9 and other gene editing technologies. While PGT is about selection, choosing the best option from a given set, gene editing is about correction. It offers the potential to go into an embryo's DNA and fix a typo, to rewrite the genetic code itself. CRISPR is often described as a pair of molecular scissors. It uses a guide molecule, the guide RNA, to find a specific sequence of DNA, and an enzyme, the Cas9 protein, to make a cut. The cell's natural repair mechanisms then patch up the cut, and in the process, a new piece of DNA can be inserted. This has revolutionary potential for medicine. In 2023, the first CRISPR-based therapy, Casgevy, was approved in the UK and the US to treat sickle cell disease, a painful and life-threatening blood disorder. It works by taking a patient's own stem cells, editing them in a lab to fix the faulty gene, and then infusing them back into the body. This is somatic gene editing. It changes the genes of one person, but those changes are not passed on to their children. The ethical Rubicon we are approaching is germline gene editing. This means making edits to an embryo, sperm, or egg. These changes would be heritable, passed down through all subsequent generations. This is what the Chinese scientist He Jiankui controversially claimed to have done in 2018, creating the first gene-edited babies in an attempt to make them resistant to HIV. The global scientific community reacted with outrage, not just because of the secrecy and ethical breaches, but because the technology was not yet considered safe enough for human use. The primary concern is off-target effects. The molecular scissors are not yet perfectly precise. Sometimes they cut in the wrong place, potentially causing unforeseen problems, like creating a new mutation that could lead to cancer. Another risk is mosaicism, where the edit doesn't take hold in all of the embryo's cells, leading to a patchwork of edited and unedited cells in the resulting person. Because of these risks, germline editing is currently banned or heavily restricted in most countries. But the research is continuing at a furious pace. Scientists are developing more precise versions of CRISPR, like base editing and prime editing, which are more like a pencil and eraser than scissors, able to change single letters of the genetic code without breaking the DNA strand, significantly reducing the risk of off-target effects. It is a near certainty that within the next decade, the technology will be deemed safe enough for use in correcting severe single-gene disorders where no healthy embryo is available through PGT. The first approved cases will be for couples who are both carriers of a recessive disease, meaning all of their embryos would be affected. For them, editing would be the only path to a biologically related, healthy child. And this is how the door opens. The technology on the table today is a powerful combination. IVF provides the access. PGT provides the ability to read and select. AI provides the analytical power to make sense of the data and optimize for outcomes. And CRISPR provides the eventual ability to write and correct. Right now, these tools are largely siloed and used for clear-cut medical needs. But the story of technology is a story of convergence and mission creep. The AI that grades embryo viability today will grade for polygenic risk scores tomorrow. The CRISPR technique perfected for curing Tay-Sachs will be adaptable for altering metabolic function. Each piece is developing on its own logical, medically justified track. But when you assemble them, you create a system of unprecedented power to direct human evolution, not in 100 years, but in the next 20. The tools are not coming. They are here. They are just getting better. The journey from curing disease to optimizing traits is not a sudden leap, but a slow, almost imperceptible slide down a very slippery slope. It begins with a line that seems bright and clear, drawn in the sand of medical ethics. On one side, we have therapy, correcting a defect, curing a disease, restoring a person to a state of normal health. On the other side, we have enhancement, taking a healthy, normal individual and making them better than well. The consensus today, among scientists, ethicists, and the public, is that therapy is a noble goal, while enhancement is a dangerous and hubristic one. The problem is that this bright line begins to blur the moment you look at it closely, especially through the lens of genetics. Let's take a concrete example. Heart disease is the leading cause of death globally. We know there are certain genes, like mutations in the PCSK9 gene, that can lead to extremely high levels of LDL cholesterol and a dramatically increased risk of a heart attack at a young age. Using PGT to select an embryo without this mutation, or one day using CRISPR to correct it, is unambiguously therapy. It's preventing a clear and present danger. But what about the spectrum of normal? Most of us don't have a single high-impact mutation. Instead, our risk for heart disease is determined by a complex interplay of dozens, or even hundreds, of small genetic variations, each nudging our cholesterol or blood pressure slightly up or down. This is what's known as a polygenic trait. Now, imagine a clinic offers a polygenic risk score for cardiovascular health. They analyze an embryo's genome and report that it's in the 70th percentile for risk, perfectly normal, but slightly higher than average. However, they have another embryo that, due to a different combination of these common genetic variants, is in the 10th percentile for risk. Choosing the second embryo is no longer about avoiding a specific disease. It's about choosing a lower probability of developing a disease in the future. Is this still therapy? Or is it the first step into enhancement? What if, a few years later, technology allows us to make a few minor edits to the first embryo's genome, nudging its risk profile down from the 70th to the 10th percentile? Where precisely on that continuum did we cross the line? The line dissolves into a gradient, and each step along that gradient can be justified with the same benevolent logic, giving a child the best possible chance at a long and healthy life. This challenge becomes exponentially more complex and ethically fraught when we move from disease risk to traits like height or intelligence. These are the quintessential polygenic traits, influenced by thousands of genetic variants, each with a minuscule effect, all interacting with a lifetime of environmental inputs. There is no single intelligence gene to switch on. Instead, what we have are genome-wide association studies, GWAS, which are massive research projects that scan the genomes of hundreds of thousands of individuals and find statistical correlations between certain genetic markers and specific outcomes, like years of education or performance on cognitive tests. From this data, scientists can create polygenic scores, PGS. A PGS for educational attainment, for instance, might aggregate the effects of thousands of variants to predict, with some limited accuracy, how likely a person is to complete a university degree. Today, the predictive power of these scores is still quite weak. A polygenic score can currently explain maybe 10 to 15% of the variation in IQ among individuals. That's not enough to be useful for embryo selection in a clinical setting. But this predictive power is increasing every year as the datasets for GWAS grow larger and the analytical algorithms become more sophisticated. The path from today to 2045 is paved with incremental improvements in this specific area. Imagine a timeline. By 2028, a company like 23andMe or a major fertility network might offer parents a genomic potential report for their embryos, providing polygenic scores for dozens of traits, framed not as a guarantee, but as an informational tool, much like the viability score is today. By 2035, as the accuracy of these scores improves to explain, say, 30 or 40% of the variance in a trait, clinics will begin to quietly incorporate them into their selection process. The choice offered won't be pick the smartest embryo. It will be more subtle. Embryo A has a slightly elevated risk for developing cognitive deficits later in life, while embryo B shows a strong correlation with markers for cognitive resilience. Which would you choose? The final step, perhaps arriving by 2045, is the move from selection to active editing for these traits. This won't happen overnight. It will begin with correcting genetic variants that are strongly associated with learning disabilities. From there, it's a small step to optimizing the profile for educational attainment. This wouldn't involve inserting a fictional genius gene, but making perhaps 100 small, precise edits across the genome, nudging each of the relevant variants from its slightly negative version to its slightly positive version. The cumulative effect would be a statistically significant, though not dramatic, increase in the probability of higher cognitive performance. Each edit, taken in isolation, would be indistinguishable from a naturally occurring, healthy human variant. The procedure would be framed as simply removing genetic barriers to learning, ensuring the child can reach their full, natural potential. This incremental path is what makes the future so plausible. There won't be a single dramatic moment where society decides to embrace designer babies. Instead, there will be a series of small, seemingly reasonable steps. First, we perfect the tools to eliminate devastating single-gene disorders. Second, we develop the ability to select embryos with the lowest polygenic risk for common diseases like diabetes and schizophrenia. Third, we use that same selection methodology to choose embryos with a higher probability of positive health and cognitive outcomes. And finally, when the technology is safe enough, we move from merely selecting the best available option to editing an embryo to create an even better one. At each stage, the justification remains the same. We are reducing suffering and expanding human potential. The bright line between therapy and enhancement will have been erased not by a single act of transgression, but by 1,000 small, well-intentioned steps in the same direction. The choice will no longer be about preventing a tragedy, but about securing an advantage, And the logic of giving your child every possible advantage is a powerful one indeed. While social desires and technological capabilities create the pull towards a genetically optimized future, it is the cold, hard logic of the insurance market that will provide the decisive push. Insurance, at its core, is a business of pricing risk. Every day, actuaries and algorithms calculate the probability of future events: a car crash, a house fire, a heart attack, and attach a price tag to that uncertainty. The less risk you represent, the less you pay. This simple, powerful mechanism has shaped human behavior for centuries, encouraging us to install smoke detectors, wear seatbelts, and stop smoking. Now, imagine this same mechanism applied to the most fundamental source of risk in human health: our own genetic code. The first and most direct way this will manifest is through risk-based pricing for health and life insurance. In a future where comprehensive genomic sequencing at the embryonic stage is cheap and routine, an insurance company will have access to a new universe of data. For a prospective child, they will be able to calculate a lifetime probability score for hundreds of conditions, from juvenile diabetes to Alzheimer's disease. Faced with this data, their business model will compel them to act. A child born with a standard, unedited genome will represent a collection of unknown and therefore expensive risks. A child whose genome has been screened and de-risked, cleared of major monogenic disorders, and selected for a low polygenic risk profile for common illnesses will represent a far more predictable and profitable client. The result is inevitable: massive premium discounts for optimized children. Think about the financial decision facing a new family. They could have a child through natural conception and face a health insurance premium of, say, $1,000 a month. Or they could opt for IVF with a comprehensive genetic screening and optimization package and be offered a premium of $200 a month for the same coverage for the entire life of the child. That's a savings of nearly $10,000 a year, compounding over decades. For most middle-class families, that is not a trivial choice. It's a decision with profound implications for their financial stability, their ability to save for college, or their own retirement. The freedom to choose a natural birth becomes a luxury good, a philosophical stance that carries a steep and continuous financial penalty. The insurance market doesn't need to forbid natural conception. It just needs to make it economically irrational for the vast majority of the population. This financial pressure will be bolstered by a powerful new ethical concept, the preventable genetic burden, or PGB. This argument will be advanced not just by insurers, but by state-funded healthcare systems struggling with the rising costs of an aging population. The logic is simple and compelling. If a condition like Huntington's disease, a brutal neurodegenerative disorder that incurs immense costs for late-stage care, is now completely preventable through a safe and accessible screening procedure, should the public health system, and by extension the taxpayer, be obligated to cover the enormous expense of treating a case that could have been avoided? The conversation will shift from a right to healthcare to a responsibility to prevent illness when possible. We will see the emergence of policies where state healthcare systems or private insurers will fully cover the cost of IVF and genetic screening, making it the most affordable path to parenthood. However, they may simultaneously announce that they will no longer cover the long-term care costs for a specific list of preventable genetic conditions if the parents consciously chose to forego screening. This isn't a denial of emergency care, but a shift in financial responsibility for chronic, predictable conditions. Suddenly, the choice not to screen is no longer just a personal one. It's a decision that carries the risk of financial ruin if the genetic lottery turns out unfavorably. It reframes the act of natural conception as a gamble, not just with your child's health, but with your family's entire economic future. This is not a far-fetched scenario. We have a clear real-world precedent for how insurance and public health mandates can drive the adoption of new medical technologies. Consider vaccines. In many places, the state doesn't force you to be vaccinated, but it uses powerful incentives and disincentives to encourage it. Public schools require proof of vaccination for entry, and many companies and government agencies do the same. The system is designed to make vaccination the path of least resistance. The same model can be applied to genetic screening. Universities might one day require a genetic health certificate for admission to their student health plans. Certain high-stakes professions, like airline pilots or surgeons, could require screening for genetic markers associated with sudden neurological events. Each step will be justified on the grounds of safety, responsibility, and fiscal prudence. The market will also create its own feedback loop. As more and more of the population is genomically optimized, the baseline for a healthy human will shift. The actuarial tables will be rewritten. The average lifespan will increase, and the incidence of many chronic diseases will plummet within the optimized cohort. Against this new baseline, the health outcomes and lifetime costs associated with the natural population will look increasingly poor and expensive. The premium gap between the two groups will widen further, increasing the financial pressure on the next generation of parents. The system will naturally and inexorably push society towards a single, optimized standard, not through a grand conspiracy, but through the silent, relentless logic of risk and money. The choice to have a child naturally will still exist, enshrined in law and principle, but it will be a choice that fewer and fewer people can afford to make. The committee that designs our children will not be a government panel, but a far more powerful and anonymous entity, the global insurance and capital markets. The economic pressures exerted by the insurance market will be mirrored and amplified by a profound shift in our social fabric. The very definition of what it means to be a responsible parent will be rewritten in the language of genetic stewardship. This transformation won't happen because of a government decree. It will happen the way all major social norms change, through a slow, steady cascade of conversations, media portrayals, and the quiet establishment of new expectations. It will begin with the best of intentions, rooted in the universal desire to protect children and give them a healthy start. Public health campaigns, once focused on prenatal nutrition and avoiding alcohol, will evolve. By the early 2030s, we can expect to see government-sponsored advertisements that are visually indistinguishable from today's campaigns for folic acid or breastfeeding. A gentle, authoritative voice will explain, "Just as you wouldn't forget a car seat, don't forget the most important checkup of all." A simple genomic screening can protect your child from over 100 preventable conditions. Ask your doctor about the Healthy Start panel. The message will be one of empowerment, safety, and due diligence. It will frame optimization not as a radical new technology, but as a standard, essential part of modern prenatal care. The next logical step after ultrasounds and vitamin supplements. The media will play a crucial role in normalizing this perspective. Sunday supplement articles and morning talk shows will feature heartwarming stories of families who, through genetic screening, were able to have a healthy child after generations of suffering from a hereditary illness. Tech influencers and celebrity parents will share their optimization journeys on social media, showcasing their beautiful, thriving children and framing their choice as a smart, proactive, and loving one. Conversely, the media will also, perhaps unintentionally, create the narrative of risk. A tragic story about a child born with a severe but screenable genetic disorder will inevitably be followed by the implicit or explicit question, why wasn't this prevented? The parents in such a story will be portrayed as victims of a terrible tragedy, but a subtle undercurrent of judgment will begin to form in the public consciousness. They will be seen as unlucky, but also, perhaps, as having failed to take a simple, available precaution. This emerging social norm will create a new and powerful form of stigma, one directed at the parents of naturals, especially those who develop preventable conditions. This won't necessarily be overt or malicious. It will manifest in the small, quiet moments of social interaction. A concerned look from another parent at the playground when a child has a severe allergic reaction. A doctor's slightly judgmental tone when taking a family history, noting that the child's predisposition to type 1 diabetes could have been identified and potentially mitigated. The awkward silence when a couple announces they are letting nature take its course with their pregnancy. It will be the social equivalent of choosing not to put a helmet on your child while they learn to ride a bicycle. While legally permissible, it will be seen by many as a negligent, almost reckless act of philosophical purity. The parents will be forced into a defensive posture, needing to justify a choice that, a generation earlier, was simply the default state of humanity. Perhaps the most insidious pressure will come from the educational system. The sorting and stratification of children begins at a very young age, and the introduction of genomic data will add a powerful new dimension to this process. It's unlikely that elite preschools or universities will ever have an explicit policy stating, "We only accept optimized children." The mechanisms will be far more subtle and legally defensible. Admissions criteria might include a holistic wellness assessment, for which a genomic health profile is a key input. Schools may argue that they need this data to provide a safe and supportive environment, to be prepared for potential health issues, or to tailor educational programs to a child's cognitive predispositions. A school might, for instance, offer a highly competitive, accelerated learning track and use polygenic scores for cognitive aptitude as one of several factors in its selection process, arguing that it's no different from using an IQ test or a teacher recommendation. At the university level, an application for a demanding program like medicine or engineering might be subtly strengthened by a genomic report showing markers for high conscientiousness and stress resilience. No one is being explicitly excluded because they are unnatural. They are simply being outcompeted by candidates who, on paper, present as lower risk and higher potential. The system doesn't create a wall. It creates a steep, slippery incline that is much easier for the genetically optimized to climb. This creates a vicious cycle for parents. Knowing that their child will one day have to compete in this environment, the pressure to provide them with every possible advantage becomes immense. The decision to optimize is no longer just about preventing disease. It becomes about ensuring their child's future social and economic mobility. The parental duty to provide for your child expands to include providing the best possible genetic starting point. The responsible parent in this new world is the one who meticulously manages their child's genetic portfolio, just as they would manage their college savings fund. To do otherwise is to risk consigning them to a life of disadvantage, a life on the wrong side of a new and profound social divide. The choice is still technically theirs, but it is made under the crushing weight of a society that has already decided which choice is the right one. As we move into the 2040s, the cumulative effect of these economic and social pressures will bring a new social stratum into sharp relief: the genetic underclass. This won't be a group defined by race or traditional economic class, though it will certainly overlap with them. It will be a cohort of individuals whose defining characteristic is their natural, unedited genome, in a world where the majority of their peers have been optimized. Life for this group will be a constant, low-grade struggle against a system that was not built for them, a world that views their very biology as suboptimal and their preventable flaws as a personal or parental failing. The challenges they face will be both practical and psychological, playing out in courtrooms, workplaces, and the quiet recesses of their own minds. The first wave of legal challenges will likely emerge around 2045, brought by the first generation of naturally born adults who have grown up in this new reality. Imagine a case study. Anya Sharma, a 28-year-old software engineer. Anya is highly intelligent and skilled, but her genetic profile, which is part of her standard digital health record, indicates a 60% lifetime risk of developing severe clinical depression, a condition that could have been mitigated by selecting an embryo with a different polygenic score. She is turned down for a coveted position, leading a high-stress, long-term project at a major tech firm. The company's official reason is that another candidate was a better fit. But Anya's lawyers will file a discrimination lawsuit, arguing that the hiring algorithm, which flags candidates with high-risk markers for mental health instability, is a form of genetic discrimination. The corporation's defense will be pragmatic and powerful. They will argue that they have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to ensure the success of a billion-dollar project, and that placing it under the leadership of someone with a high, predictable risk of a debilitating mental health episode is an unacceptable gamble. They will claim it is no different from not hiring a pilot who has a heart condition. The case, Sharma v. Cygnus Corp., will become a landmark, forcing society to confront a question it has been avoiding. Where is the line between prudent risk management and illegal genetic prejudice? The outcome is uncertain, but the very existence of such lawsuits reveals a world where your genetic code is no longer a private matter of health, but a public marker of your employability and perceived reliability. Beyond the courtroom, the psychological impact on the genetic underclass will be profound and pervasive. Imagine growing up with the knowledge, not as a vague anxiety, but as a scientifically documented fact, that you are carrying preventable flaws. You live with the awareness that your struggles with anxiety, your middling athletic ability, or your difficulty learning a new language are not just part of the human condition, but are specific, identifiable genetic markers that your parents could have chosen to edit out. This knowledge creates a uniquely modern form of existential burden. Every personal failure, every setback, every illness is filtered through the question, was this inevitable? Was I designed to fail in this specific way? This can lead to a deep-seated feeling of resentment, not only towards a society that implicitly values you less, but potentially towards your own parents. The parent-child relationship, already complex, becomes freighted with a new and terrible question. Why didn't you give me the best chance? The parents, in turn, may live with a lifetime of guilt, second-guessing a decision they made with the best of intentions, perhaps out of a philosophical commitment to nature or a fear of new technology. This psychological schism, the knowledge of what could have been, will be a quiet, constant companion for many in the natural-born community. In response to these systemic pressures and internal struggles, we will see the emergence of intentional communities of naturals. These won't be isolated rural communes, but networked urban and digital enclaves. They will be people who make a conscious, collective choice to reject the logic of optimization. They will create their own schools, where admission is not dependent on a genomic wellness score. They will form their own businesses, building an alternative economy based on principles of genetic diversity and acceptance of human imperfection. They will establish their own dating apps and social networks, seeking partners who share their values and are not concerned with the genetic portfolio of their future children. These communities will be havens of acceptance, places where a predisposition to melancholy is not seen as a risk factor to be managed, but as a potential source of artistic creativity. They will celebrate neurodiversity and the full, messy spectrum of human traits. They will become the cultural custodians of what it meant to be human in the pre-optimization era. However, these communities will also risk becoming ghettos. By withdrawing from mainstream society, they may further marginalize themselves, cutting themselves off from the economic and social opportunities available in the optimized world. They will be seen by the majority as Luddites, clinging to a romanticized and inefficient past, choosing to embrace suffering out of stubbornness. Society will fracture along a new fault line, not of geography or nationality, but of biology itself. The genetic underclass will be composed of those who cannot afford optimization and those who philosophically refuse it. And both will find themselves living in a world that is increasingly alien to them, a world that has quietly redefined them as obsolete. As society drifts towards a consensus on optimization, a question of immense gravity looms in the background, one that is rarely asked aloud in the sterile, reassuring environment of a fertility clinic. Who, exactly, writes the human template? The process feels decentralized and individualistic. Millions of parents making personal choices. But the choices they make are constrained by the options presented to them. And these options are being curated and defined by a new, powerful, and largely invisible authority, the algorithms that decide what constitutes an optimal human. This is where the risk of bias, both old and new, enters the system, not with the malice of a totalitarian state, but with the cold, unthinking efficiency of machine learning. Every AI system is a product of its training data. An algorithm designed to identify the best embryos will be trained on vast data sets of genomic information correlated with real-world life outcomes. The problem is that these data sets will inevitably reflect the biases and inequalities of the world we live in now. For instance, the first and largest genomic databases, like the UK Biobank, are overwhelmingly composed of data from individuals of European descent. An AI trained on this data will be much better at predicting outcomes for white Europeans than for people of African, Asian, or indigenous descent. Its definition of a low-risk or high-potential genome will be skewed towards the genetic patterns of the dominant demographic in its training set. The consequences are deeply troubling. Traits or genetic variations that are common and perfectly healthy in minority populations might be flagged by the algorithm as anomalous or even undesirable, simply because they are underrepresented in the data. A polygenic score for cognitive aptitude developed from a data set of Western University graduates will not be measuring raw intelligence. It will be measuring the specific combination of genetic and environmental factors that lead to success within that specific cultural and educational system. In practice, this means the AI could end up systematically selecting for embryos that are genetically more similar to the existing global elite, inadvertently laundering social and racial biases through a veneer of objective scientific analysis. The human template, it writes, will be a reflection of the values and privileges of its creators, subtly but inexorably pushing the human gene pool towards a more homogeneous, westernized ideal. This leads to the second great risk, the death of diversity. Evolution works through variation. A wide and diverse gene pool is humanity's ultimate insurance policy against the unknown. It contains the raw material to adapt to new diseases, changing climates, and unforeseen environmental pressures. The bubonic plague, for example, wiped out a huge portion of Europe's population, but a small percentage of people survived because they happened to carry a genetic mutation, CCR5 delta 32, which offered them protection. This mutation had no known benefit before the plague. It was just a piece of random genetic noise. But in that specific context, it became the key to survival. What happens when our optimization algorithms, in their quest to eliminate all known risk factors and smooth out the anomalies, systematically edit away these seemingly useless variations? By selecting for a narrow band of optimal traits, we are essentially placing all our evolutionary eggs in one basket. We are betting that we know, today, exactly what will be required to thrive in the world of tomorrow. This is an act of incredible hubris. We might succeed in creating a generation of humans who are highly resistant to the cancers and heart diseases of the 21st century, only to discover that we have inadvertently made them uniformly vulnerable to a novel virus that emerges in the 22nd. We might optimize for the kind of logical, analytical intelligence that excels in our current technological economy, only to find that we have edited out the genetic predispositions for the divergent, creative, and intuitive thinking needed to solve the next set of global challenges. The systematic reduction of our own genetic diversity is a long-term existential risk, a self-inflicted wound that we may not recognize until it is too late to heal. Finally, this raises a profound philosophical question that cuts to the heart of what we value in the human experience. Let's take the specific example of Down syndrome. Through routine prenatal screening and PGT, we are already moving towards a world where it could be almost entirely eliminated. In some countries, like Iceland and Denmark, the birth rate of children with Down syndrome has dropped by over 95%. On one level, this can be seen as a victory over a condition that causes intellectual disability and a host of serious health problems. But is a world without Down syndrome an unequivocally better world? Or is it simply a less diverse, less tolerant, and perhaps less compassionate one? People with Down syndrome and the families who love them often report lives of immense joy, connection, and unique perspective. The challenges are real, but they are not the entirety of the story. The presence of cognitive diversity in our society forces us to build muscles of empathy, patience, and unconditional acceptance. It challenges our narrow definitions of success and productivity. By choosing to eliminate this form of human variation, we are not just preventing a medical condition, we are making a value judgment. We are implicitly stating that a certain kind of human experience is not worth living. When we apply this logic across the entire spectrum of human traits, from ADHD to predispositions for melancholy, the template we design becomes not just a healthier one, but an increasingly narrow and uniform one. We risk creating a world that is more efficient, more predictable, and more productive, but also one that has lost something of its soul. A world that has traded the messy, unpredictable, and often beautiful tapestry of human diversity for a sterile and perfectly optimized monoculture. As the technologies of genetic optimization mature, their adoption will not be uniform across the globe. Instead, we will see a dramatic and consequential divergence in national policies, leading to a new form of geopolitical fragmentation. The world will be carved into distinct zones of genetic regulation, creating a planet of havens and holdouts, each operating under a different set of rules and a different vision of humanity's future. This regulatory patchwork will not be random. It will be shaped by the deep currents of a nation's history, culture, and economic ambitions. On one side of this new divide, we will have nations that embrace genetic enhancement as a strategic imperative. Countries like Singapore, China, or the United Arab Emirates, which often prioritize long-term national planning, technological advancement, and global competitiveness, may see state-sponsored optimization as a logical next step. For them, enhancing the cognitive abilities, health span, and resilience of their population could be framed as a matter of national security and economic destiny. A healthier, more intelligent, and more productive populace is a powerful competitive advantage in a globalized world. These nations might establish highly regulated, state-of-the-art facilities, offering free or heavily subsidized genetic screening and enhancement to all citizens. The project would be presented not as a consumer choice, but as a collective investment in the nation's future, a 21st century equivalent of building highways or investing in public education. On the other side of the spectrum, we will find nations that, for powerful historical and ethical reasons, will ban genetic enhancement outright. Germany, with its history of Nazi eugenics, is a prime example. The societal trauma of the past will likely lead to constitutional prohibitions against any form of germline modification that goes beyond the prevention of severe disease. Italy, influenced by the Catholic Church's views on the sanctity of life and the inviolability of the human embryo, might also enact strict prohibitions. These nations will become genetic holdouts, creating legal and ethical firewalls to preserve what they see as the essential, natural state of humanity. They will argue that the risks of creating a fractured species, of reviving the ghost of eugenics, and of commodifying human life are far too great to justify the potential benefits of enhancement. In between these two poles will be the majority of nations, including much of Europe and North America, which will likely muddle through with a complex, often contradictory, and constantly shifting set of regulations. In these countries, the debate will be fierce. A powerful libertarian and market-driven ethos will clash with a strong tradition of social equality and precautionary principles. The result will be a messy compromise. Germline editing for clear-cut diseases might be permitted under strict oversight, while enhancement for traits like intelligence will be officially banned. However, the line between the two will be endlessly debated and litigated, and the enforcement of these bans will be notoriously difficult. The system will be one of official prohibition, but tacit tolerance, creating a gray market where the wealthy can access services through private, high-end clinics that know how to navigate the legal loopholes. This global regulatory divergence will inevitably give rise to a thriving new industry: reproductive tourism. Just as people today travel for medical procedures or surrogacy, parents of the future will cross borders to access the genetic services they desire. A wealthy couple from Germany, unable to legally access cognitive enhancement for their embryo at home, might take a 3-week vacation to a clinic in Dubai. Conversely, a family from China, assigned a standard optimization package by the state, might travel to a boutique clinic in California for a more bespoke, less invasive screening process, or even to a natural conception retreat in a country that has banned the technology entirely. Borders will become permeable membranes for the flow of genetic capital. This will create a world where national laws become largely symbolic for those with the means to travel, effectively creating a global, unregulated marketplace for the human genome. The long-term consequence of this fragmentation will be the emergence of a new global genetic divide, a form of international inequality more profound and permanent than any that has come before. We will see the beginnings of a biological divergence between the populations of optimized nations and natural nations. Over generations, the compounding advantages of enhanced health, longevity, and cognitive ability in the upgraded populations could create tangible differences in economic productivity, scientific innovation, and even military capability. The citizens of enhancement-embracing nations may come to view the citizens of natural nations as tragically disadvantaged, fragile, and inefficient. Conversely, the naturals may see the optimized as arrogant, soulless, and dangerously detached from the authentic human experience. This biological stratification will add a dangerous new layer to international relations. Trade negotiations, diplomatic alliances, and global conflicts could all be influenced by this underlying biological reality. It could create a permanent global caste system, written not in laws, but in our very DNA. The genetic havens will become the engines of the global economy, but they may do so at the cost of their own humanity. The natural nations may preserve a deeper sense of human diversity and humility, but they risk becoming the stagnant backwaters of a world that has passed them by. The planet will no longer be divided merely by ideology or wealth, but by the very definition of what it means to be human. In a future where the pressures to optimize are systemic and pervasive, resistance is inevitable. It will not be a single, unified movement, but a diverse and often fractious coalition of individuals and groups who, for different reasons, reject the premises of the new genetic age. This resistance will operate on multiple fronts. From the halls of Parliament and the courtrooms to the shadowy corners of the digital and physical worlds. Its central, unifying cry will be for cognitive and genetic liberty, the fundamental right to be born and to live with the beautiful and necessary flaws inherent in the human condition. The public face of this opposition will be the Right to be Flawed movement. This will be a broad alliance bringing together constituencies that are often on opposite sides of the political spectrum. On one side, you will have religious groups, from conservative evangelicals to the Vatican, arguing from a theological standpoint that humanity has no right to play God, and that rewriting the code of life is an act of ultimate hubris that severs our connection to the divine. On another side, you will have disability rights advocates who will be among the most powerful and articulate voices in the movement. They will argue from lived experience that the drive to eliminate conditions like deafness, dwarfism, or autism is not a compassionate act, but a form of existential erasure. They will contend that their unique ways of being are not diseases to be cured, but valuable forms of human diversity that enrich society, and that the problem is not their genetics, but a society that is unwilling to accommodate difference. Joining them will be a contingent of bioethicists and left-leaning social critics who will warn of the creation of a new genetic caste system and the exacerbation of social inequality. They will be the ones publishing op-eds in major newspapers, organizing university teach-ins, and lobbying politicians to enact stricter regulations. And, perhaps surprisingly, they will find allies among a certain strain of right-wing libertarians who will object to the entire system on the grounds of individual liberty, arguing against the encroachment of insurance companies and the state into the most private of all family decisions. This coalition, though ideologically messy, will be united by a shared fear that the relentless pursuit of perfection will lead to a less free, less tolerant, and less humane world. They will stage protests, challenge discriminatory policies in court, and work to create cultural and legal sanctuary spaces for natural humanity. While the public movement fights its battles in the open, a parallel world of resistance will emerge in the shadows, catering to those who wish to opt out of the system, but lack the means to do so openly. This will give rise to underground clinics, the genetic equivalent of the speakeasies of the Prohibition era. These clinics will offer services to parents who want to ensure a natural, unedited pregnancy, free from the surveillance of state healthcare databases or insurance company oversight. Located in regulatory gray zones or operating through mobile facilities, these clinics will provide prenatal care off the grid. They might be run by idealistic doctors and midwives who believe in the cause, or by cynical operators simply looking to profit from a new market of dissenters. For a high fee, a couple could go to one of these clinics for the duration of a pregnancy. The clinic would handle the birth and create a falsified medical record for the child, one that shows a standard birth within the mainstream system, perhaps with a basic, clean genomic screen that has been digitally altered. This allows the child to enter society without the immediate stigma or insurance penalties of being a known natural. It becomes a form of biological identity laundering, a way to escape the system by hiding in plain sight. These services would, of course, be expensive and legally risky, accessible only to a small minority who are both wealthy and determined enough to pursue them. Time 2.0. The digital realm will be another crucial front for the resistance. As genomic data becomes a standard part of our digital identity, a new breed of ethical hackers and privacy advocates will emerge. Their goal will be to disrupt the surveillance infrastructure that underpins the optimization system. They might develop sophisticated encryption tools that allow parents to store their child's true genomic data securely while presenting a public version to institutions that demand it. More audaciously, some might offer services to cloak an embryo's natural genetic markers from state or insurance databases. This could involve creating a synthetic genomic profile, one that appears to be perfectly optimized, and substituting it for the real one in official records. This digital subterfuge would be a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. The institutions would constantly be upgrading their security and biometric verification systems, while the hackers would constantly be looking for new vulnerabilities. Getting caught could lead to severe consequences, from massive fines and insurance blacklisting to criminal charges of fraud. But for those who believe that genetic privacy is a fundamental human right, the risks will be worth it. They will see themselves not as criminals, but as freedom fighters in a new kind of information war, one where the territory being fought over is the integrity of the human genome itself. The resistance, in all its forms, highlights a fundamental tension in this future society. It shows that even in a world that offers the promise of a healthier, longer, and more capable life, a significant portion of humanity will continue to believe that some things are more important than perfection. Things like freedom, diversity, privacy, and the untamed, unpredictable beauty of the natural human spirit. As the debate over human optimization rages, a powerful and unexpected justification will enter the mainstream conversation, shifting the ethical calculus for many. The argument will be made that genetic enhancement is not merely a matter of individual health or competitive advantage, but a crucial tool for ensuring the long-term survival of humanity on a rapidly changing planet. The climate crisis and the broader ecological emergency will be invoked as the ultimate rationale for taking control of our own biology. Proponents will argue that we are running out of time to change our behavior, so we must instead change ourselves. The concept of engineering ecological humans will move from the fringes of transhumanist thought into serious policy discussions. The logic is both seductive and alarming. If a primary driver of climate change is our resource consumption, our diet, our energy use, our metabolism, then why not engineer humans to require fewer resources? Scientists might propose, for instance, a suite of genetic modifications aimed at reducing the ecological footprint of each individual. This could include edits to the genes that regulate appetite and metabolism, creating people who feel satiated with smaller quantities of food and who can more efficiently process plant-based proteins, reducing the immense environmental burden of industrial animal agriculture. Further enhancements could be proposed to help humanity adapt to the unavoidable consequences of climate change. As global temperatures rise, we could engineer humans with enhanced thermotolerance, allowing them to function more effectively in extreme heat. With the growing threat of new zoonotic diseases emerging from disrupted ecosystems, we could use CRISPR to build in broad-spectrum viral resistance, essentially upgrading the human immune system to be more resilient against novel pathogens. Some might even propose more radical interventions, like modifying the genes for height to create a population that is, on average, 10% smaller, thereby requiring proportionally less food, water, and living space over a lifetime. Each of these proposals will be framed not as an enhancement for personal gain, but as a selfless act of ecological responsibility, a necessary sacrifice of our natural form for the sake of the collective good and the survival of the biosphere. This environmental justification will be incredibly persuasive because it reframes the entire debate. It moves the conversation away from uncomfortable topics like eugenics and social inequality and places it squarely in the context of global crisis and survival. It appeals to the progressive, environmentally conscious segment of the population that might otherwise be deeply skeptical of genetic engineering. An argument that sounds like hubris when framed as, "Let's make smarter babies," sounds like prudent foresight when framed as, "Let's ensure our children can survive on a hotter, more dangerous planet." It transforms a luxury consumer good into a potential planetary salvation technology. This narrative will be particularly powerful among younger generations who have grown up under the shadow of ecological collapse and who may be more open to radical technological solutions. However, this line of reasoning presents a profound moral hazard. The moral hazard, a concept borrowed from economics, describes a situation where a party is more willing to take risks because the potential negative consequences are borne by others. In this context, does fixing humanity distract from the primary and much harder task of fixing our broken relationship with the planet? Critics will argue that this is a dangerous technological fix, an attempt to engineer our way out of a problem that was created by our social, economic, and political systems. It addresses the symptom, our biological vulnerability, instead of the disease, a global economy built on unsustainable extraction and consumption. The danger is that focusing on biological adaptation could diminish the urgency for systemic change. Why make the difficult political sacrifices required to transition to a zero-carbon economy if we can simply engineer our descendants to tolerate the heat? Why fundamentally restructure our food systems if we can tweak our metabolism to require less? It becomes a way to maintain the status quo, to continue our destructive habits by offloading the cost of adaptation onto the biology of future generations. It is, critics will argue, the ultimate act of intergenerational buck-passing, a decision to alter our children rather than alter our lifestyles. It prioritizes the comfort of the present over the biological integrity of the future. Furthermore, there is the question of resource allocation. The vision of a global-scale genetic optimization program is one that would require an almost unimaginable investment of energy, money, and scientific talent. The infrastructure needed, the clinics, the genetic sequencing labs, the vast server farms for storing and analyzing genomic data, would itself have a massive carbon footprint. We must ask, is this the best use of our finite resources in a time of crisis? Could the trillions of dollars and the brilliant minds dedicated to engineering a more climate-resilient human be better spent on developing renewable energy, restoring ecosystems, or creating a circular economy? The environmental justification for human enhancement creates a paradox. A program intended to solve the ecological crisis could end up diverting the very resources needed to address its root causes, all while creating a host of new and unforeseen ethical dilemmas. The planet may need saving, but the question of whether we should turn ourselves into the primary subject of the experiment remains one of the most consequential we will ever face. As the practice of genetic optimization becomes woven into the fabric of society, the law will find itself in a desperate and perpetual game of catch-up. Our legal systems, built on centuries-old principles of individual autonomy, responsibility, and clearly defined harm, will struggle to adapt to a world where disadvantage is probabilistic and causality is written in the subtle language of the genome. The courtrooms of the mid-21st century will become the primary battlegrounds where society attempts to draw new ethical lines, often years after the technology has already rendered the old ones obsolete. Three key areas of conflict will dominate this new legal landscape: defining genetic discrimination, establishing the rights of the embryo, and untangling the web of corporate liability. The first and most immediate challenge will be to define and prove genetic discrimination. We have already explored the hypothetical case of Anya Sharma, the software engineer denied a job due to her genetic predisposition for depression. The central difficulty in such cases is proving intent. An employer or an insurance company will almost never explicitly state that a decision was based on a genetic marker. They will point to a dozen other legitimate factors: experience, interview performance, a cultural fit. The genetic data will simply be one input among thousands in a complex proprietary hiring algorithm. How can a plaintiff prove that this specific data point was the decisive one? It's like trying to isolate a single drop of rain in a storm. Lawmakers will attempt to pass new Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Acts, or GINAs, much like the one passed in the United States in 2008. But these new laws will need to be far more sophisticated. They will have to grapple with the probabilistic nature of polygenic scores. Is it discrimination to deny a person a loan because they have a 40% higher than average risk of developing a gambling addiction? Or is that simply prudent financial risk management? The law currently understands discrimination based on fixed categories like race or gender. It is ill-equipped to handle discrimination based on a statistical probability, a future potential that may never come to pass. Courts will be forced to decide on a threshold of certainty. Does a genetic test have to be 99% predictive of a condition to be used in decision-making, or is 51% enough? This legal ambiguity will create a chilling effect where individuals with natural or high-risk genomes live in constant uncertainty, never knowing if their biology is silently working against them in the background of every application they submit. The second great legal quagmire will revolve around the status of the embryo itself. This will reignite the abortion debate on an entirely new technological and ethical front. As the ability to screen and edit becomes more precise, a new legal concept will emerge: the right to be born free of preventable suffering. Proponents will argue that if we have the safe and reliable means to correct a gene that will cause a child a lifetime of pain and disability, it is not only permissible, but morally obligatory to do so. They will frame it as a form of prenatal child protection. This could lead to extraordinary legal cases, such as the state bringing a lawsuit against parents on behalf of an embryo, seeking a court order to compel a necessary gene edit that the parents, for religious or philosophical reasons, have refused. This flips the traditional right to life argument on its head. The question is no longer just whether an embryo has a right to be born, but whether it has a right to be born healthy. Does an embryo have a legal standing that can be asserted against the autonomy of its own parents? This will force courts to weigh the reproductive freedom of parents against a potential future child's right to a healthy life. Conversely, what if parents choose an enhancement that the state deems unnecessary or risky? Could a government agency intervene to prevent the creation of an over-enhanced child, arguing it has a compelling interest in preventing the emergence of a genetic caste system? The legal status of the embryo, already one of the most contentious issues in modern law, will become an even more complex minefield, with the very definition of parental rights and responsibilities hanging in the balance. Finally, the issue of corporate liability will create a legal tangle of unprecedented complexity. Imagine that a popular cognitive enhancement package, Clarity Plus, is used by millions of families in the 2030s. The company that developed it, a massive biotech corporation, conducted extensive short-term safety trials. But 20 years later, a statistically significant number of the Clarity Plus children begin to develop a rare and aggressive form of early-onset dementia. The enhancement, it turns out, had an unforeseen long-term side effect. Who is to blame? Is it the parents who consented to the procedure? Is it the fertility clinic that administered it? Is it the biotech corporation that developed the technology and, perhaps, cherry-picked the data from its safety trials? Or is it the AI developer whose algorithm recommended the specific genetic edits? Untangling this chain of causality will be a nightmare for the legal system. The contracts signed by parents will be filled with waivers and hold harmless clauses. The biotech firms will argue that the science was sound based on the knowledge available at the time. The AI developers will claim their algorithm is a black box, and they cannot be held responsible for its outputs. These cases will drag on for decades, creating a legal morass that could bankrupt companies and leave victims with no clear path to justice. This uncertainty will, in turn, make the insurance market for this technology incredibly volatile, potentially making enhancement liability so expensive that only the wealthiest can afford the risk. The law, in its slow, deliberate way, will try to build a framework of accountability, but it will be building on shifting sands, always one step behind a technology that is constantly redefining the very nature of harm, consent, and responsibility. Having navigated the turbulent waters of the challenges, it's essential to pause and envision a future where this technology unfolds in the best possible way. This isn't a naive fantasy of a perfect world, but a plausible, optimistic scenario where humanity successfully navigates the ethical minefields and uses these powerful tools with wisdom, foresight, and compassion. This is the future our children might inherit if we make the right choices today. In this scenario, which we can call the eradication of suffering, the primary focus of genetic technology remains steadfastly on its original promise: to alleviate human misery. By the year 2050, in this optimistic timeline, the landscape of human health has been fundamentally transformed. Genetic diseases that have haunted our species for millennia are, for all practical purposes, relics of the past. Huntington's disease, with its cruel and inexorable decline, no longer sentences families to generations of despair. Cystic fibrosis, a daily battle for breath, is a condition children learn about in history books. Tay-Sachs, which once stole infants from their parents' arms, has been relegated to a single, corrected typo in the human story. The eradication is not achieved through a coercive state program, but through the global availability of safe, affordable, and ethically managed IVF and preimplantation genetic testing. it becomes a standard, fully covered part of prenatal care in every developed and developing nation, seen as a fundamental human right. The key to this success is the establishment of a robust, independent global consortium on human genetics, perhaps an evolution of the World Health Organization. This body, staffed by a diverse group of scientists, ethicists, disability advocates, and public representatives, provides strict ethical oversight. They maintain a clear and rigorously enforced distinction between therapy and enhancement. The consortium's charter, ratified by nearly every nation, explicitly permits germline editing only for a specific, transparently maintained list of severe monogenic diseases. Any research into enhancement for polygenic traits like intelligence or height is permitted only in non-viable embryos and is subject to intense international scrutiny. This global consensus prevents a genetic arms race between nations, ensuring that the technology serves human health, not nationalistic competition. Accessibility is the cornerstone of this future. Recognizing that a technology this powerful could easily become a tool for the rich, the international community makes a concerted, decades-long effort to ensure equitable access. A global health fund, financed by a small tax on international financial transactions, subsidizes the cost of these procedures for lower-income countries and individuals. The patents for foundational CRISPR technologies are placed in the public domain for therapeutic use, preventing private corporations from holding a monopoly on human health. The result is that the benefits of genetic medicine are not hoarded by a privileged few, but are distributed as a global public good. The technology narrows the gap in health outcomes between the rich and the poor, rather than widening it into a biological chasm. In this world, human health span, the number of years a person lives in good health, dramatically increases. The burden of chronic age-related diseases is significantly lightened. By selecting for embryos with low polygenic risk scores for conditions like Alzheimer's, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes, the average 80-year-old in 2050 is as physically and cognitively robust as a 60-year-old was in our time. This has profound, positive effects on society. The strain on healthcare systems is reduced. People are able to remain active, productive, and engaged in their communities for much longer. The concept of retirement shifts, with older individuals having the vitality to start new careers, pursue lifelong learning, and contribute their accumulated wisdom to society. The focus shifts from merely extending life to enriching the quality of those extended years. Crucially, in this scenario, the right to be flawed is not just respected, but celebrated. The global consortium works hand in hand with disability communities to ensure that the language of medicine is never used to devalue their lives. The goal is to eliminate suffering, not to eliminate difference. A couple who, for their own profound reasons, chooses to have a child naturally is not stigmatized, but supported. Society makes a conscious effort to maintain and improve social support systems, ensuring that individuals with genetic conditions or disabilities have every opportunity to thrive. The focus is on building a more accommodating and compassionate world, rather than simply engineering a more uniform population. Diversity, in all its forms, is recognized as the ultimate source of humanity's resilience and creativity. With the immense burden of hereditary disease lifted and the health of the global population improved, humanity is able to redirect its energy and resources toward larger collective challenges. More scientific talent and capital are freed up to tackle climate change, develop sustainable energy sources, and explore our solar system. The political debates that once consumed nations' attention, like the spiraling costs of healthcare, are lessened, allowing for a greater focus on long-term global cooperation. The eradication of genetic disease doesn't solve all of humanity's problems, but it removes one of the greatest sources of random, unjust suffering, allowing us to face the future with a healthier, more capable, and more unified species. It is a future where we have mastered our own biology, not for the pursuit of perfection, but for the pursuit of a more compassionate and equitable world for all. Now, we must turn our gaze to a darker, more fractured, but perhaps more probable future. This is the scenario that unfolds if the market is left unchecked, if national interests triumph over global cooperation, and if our technological capabilities outpace our collective wisdom. This is the world of the fractured species, a future that isn't the result of a single catastrophic decision, but the slow, cumulative outcome of millions of seemingly rational choices made in a system without guardrails. It is a world where the promise of eliminating suffering becomes a tool for creating a new and brutally permanent form of inequality. In this future, the attempt to establish global ethical oversight fails. Competing economic blocs, the United States, China, the European Union, cannot agree on a unified regulatory framework. A genetic arms race ensues, but it's fought not with missiles, but with polygenic scores. National pride and economic strategy become deeply entangled with the perceived genetic fitness of the population. The official ban on enhancement in many Western countries becomes a hypocritical facade. The wealthiest 1% of the population simply travels to unregulated genetic havens in Dubai, Singapore, or private island clinics in the Caribbean to access the best enhancement technologies money can buy. For this global elite, optimizing their offspring is not just about health, it's about securing their dynasty. It's about ensuring their children have every conceivable advantage, cognitive, physical, and psychological, in an increasingly competitive world. The market, not a global consortium, dictates the terms. Genetic optimization becomes the ultimate luxury good, and then a necessity for anyone aspiring to the upper middle class. A tiered system emerges. The super rich get the bespoke, cutting-edge enhancements. The merely affluent get the off-the-shelf optimization packages from major corporate providers. The middle class stretches its finances to afford basic disease screening, often going into decades of debt for genetic mortgages. And the bottom half of society is left with the genetic lottery of nature, not by choice, but by economic exclusion. The technology, which could have been the great equalizer of health, becomes the ultimate engine of class stratification. The consequences of this compound over generations. The initial advantages are small: a slightly higher IQ, a more robust immune system, a greater capacity for resilience under stress. But these small advantages lead to better educational outcomes, higher paying jobs, and the accumulation of more wealth. This wealth is then used to purchase even better enhancements for the next generation. The gap, once a narrow crevice, widens into a chasm. By 2070, society is visibly bifurcated. The Gen H, or genetically enhanced, are taller, healthier, and live, on average, 30 years longer than the naturals. They dominate the leadership positions in government, science, and finance. They look, think, and even experience the world differently. A new, insidious form of prejudice emerges. Genism. It's rarely explicit. No one says, "We don't hire naturals." Instead, the logic is couched in the neutral language of data and performance. The gene H are simply, on average, more productive, more innovative, and less prone to costly health problems. The naturals are seen as a drag on the economy, a source of instability, and a reminder of a fragile, inefficient past. They are the permanent underclass, relegated to the low-skill, service jobs that haven't yet been automated. Social mobility grinds to a halt. The American dream, or its equivalent in other nations, is extinguished, replaced by a biological determinism far more rigid than any feudal system of the past. Social cohesion collapses. The two groups cease to see each other as part of the same human family. Their life experiences are so divergent that empathy becomes impossible. The gene H live in protected, sanitized enclaves, their lives managed by AI and optimized for peak performance. The naturals live in the decaying, underfunded cities of the old world, struggling with preventable diseases and a sense of profound collective despair. The shared social contract, the idea that we are all in this together, evaporates. Why should the gene H, with their superior biology and productivity, pay taxes to support the healthcare and social safety nets of the genetically irresponsible naturals? Why should the naturals feel any loyalty to a system that has designed them for obsolescence? This simmering resentment inevitably boils over into widespread unrest and conflict. The resistance is no longer a matter of peaceful protest and ethical debate. It becomes a violent struggle for survival and dignity. We see the rise of natural liberation movements, some resorting to terrorism, targeting the genetic clinics and corporate headquarters of the biotech industry. They may see themselves as Luddites smashing the new looms, but in this case, the looms are the very source code of life. The state, controlled by the gene H, responds with overwhelming force, using advanced surveillance and biometric tracking to monitor and suppress the natural population. The conflict is brutal and asymmetrical, a low-grade civil war fought not over territory, but over the definition of humanity itself. In this fractured world, the species itself has begun to diverge. While the gene H and the naturals are still technically interfertile, they rarely are. They live in different worlds, attend different schools, and occupy different social spheres. They are, for all practical purposes, two distinct subspecies of human, sharing a planet, but not a future. The great project of humanism, the centuries-long effort to expand the circle of empathy and recognize a shared humanity in all people, has failed. We have used the tools of creation to engineer our own division, trading the unpredictable messiness of a unified species for the predictable, stratified order of a world we designed but can no longer control. We find ourselves, then, standing at the head of a great delta, a place where the single river of human history begins to branch into 1,000 possible streams. Down one channel flows the hope of a world free from the ancient tyrannies of genetic disease, a future where our children are born with a greater capacity for health and happiness than any generation before them. Down another, darker channel flows the prospect of a fractured species, a world where our tools of self-improvement become the instruments of our own division, creating a biological caste system more rigid and enduring than any built on wealth or ideology. The future is not a single, predetermined road. It is a landscape of possibilities sculpted by the choices we are only now beginning to make. We have traced the subtle architecture of this coming age, not in the grand pronouncements of governments, but in the quiet logic of an insurance premium, the gentle nudge of a public health campaign, and the private hopes of a parent in a fertility clinic. We have seen how a series of small, rational, and often compassionate decisions can aggregate into a force powerful enough to reshape the very definition of what it means to be human. The journey from preventing a terrible illness to optimizing for a desirable trait is a slope made slippery by our best intentions. The desire to give our children every advantage, to protect them from suffering, is the most powerful and noble of human instincts. Yet it is this very instinct that, when amplified by technology and guided by the market, could lead us to a future that none of us would consciously choose. This brings us to a profound paradox, perhaps the central paradox of the human condition itself. We are a species defined by our flaws, by our imperfections, our resilience, our creativity, our capacity for empathy and compassion. These qualities were not forged in a sterile environment of perfect health and predictable outcomes. They were forged in the crucible of adversity. We learned courage because we knew fear. We developed compassion because we witnessed suffering. We created art and music and philosophy to make sense of a world that was often chaotic, unjust, and painful. Our greatest strengths are inextricably bound to our deepest vulnerabilities. The jagged edges of our shared humanity are precisely what allow us to hold on to one another. What happens to these qualities in a world where risk is systematically eliminated? What becomes of empathy in a society where suffering is seen not as a part of life to be endured and understood, but as a technical problem to be edited out of the source code? What is the texture of a life without the unpredictable, the unchosen, the beautifully and terribly flawed? The drive for perfection is a drive for control, an attempt to smooth away the sharp corners of existence. But in doing so, we risk creating a world that is safe, predictable, and sterile. A world without the friction that creates the spark of genius, the fire of rebellion, or the warmth of unconditional love. We may succeed in eliminating the valleys of human experience, only to find that we have flattened the mountains as well. We are, without question, the first species to hold the tools of its own creation in its hands. We have cracked the code of life and are now learning how to rewrite it. This is a moment of awesome power and terrifying responsibility. The choices we make in the coming decades will echo for millennia, shaping not just the lives of our children, but the very trajectory of intelligent life on this planet. The ultimate question, then, is not about the technology itself. The technology is a mirror, reflecting our own values, our own hopes, and our own fears back at us. The ultimate question is about wisdom. Are we wise enough to wield these tools with the restraint they demand? Can we learn to distinguish between the elimination of suffering and the elimination of difference? Can we embrace the promise of a healthier future without sacrificing the diversity that is our greatest strength? Or is our humanity inextricably bound to the very flaws, the beautiful and necessary imperfections that we are now so eager to edit away?